Hello, my name is Amy Kaplan, and as a board member of JDCA and the vice chair of our policy committee, I want to thank you for joining today's program, Trump's Middle East Trip and What It Means for Israel. Today, we're joined by Israel Policy Forum's Chief Policy Officer, Michael Koplow. Last week, Donald Trump visited Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE in the first of the second term of his presidency. Notably, he bypassed Israel on this trip, literally by flying over Israel, and figuratively by making deals throughout the region that didn't consider Israel's security interests, including a truce with the Houthis, recognition of the new Syrian government, a Saudi agreement that didn't include normalization of ties with Israel. All of this comes against the backdrop of what has been reported as a strained relationship between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu, a new Israeli operation in Gaza, and ongoing negotiations between Trump and Iran on a nuclear deal. To help us unpack President Trump's first trip and what this all means for U.S. foreign policy and Israel, we're joined by Israel Policy Forum's Chief Policy Officer, Michael Koplow. Michael is one of the foremost experts and commentators on the Middle East, Israel, and American Jewry, and we are grateful for his insight and partnership. Michael, thank you for joining us today, and I'll now hand things over to JDCA CEO Halie Soifer.
Thank you, Amy, and I want to echo our thanks to Michael for joining us today, and thanks to all of you for being a part of this program. So Michael, we'll just get right into it. So in the president's speech in Riyadh, he expressed his vision for the future of the Middle East that was defined by commerce, not chaos. That is what he said, which seemed to be a theme of this trip, in that numerous financial deals were cut throughout the region. What did you make overall of Donald Trump's visit to the Gulf, given its financial and rather transactional focus? What U.S. foreign policy objectives, if any, were advanced during this trip?
Thanks, Halie, and thanks to JDCA for having me here as always. So I wasn't surprised by a whole lot from President Trump's trip. I think that we got largely what we expected, and we got what the president telegraphed, which was, as you correctly note, Halie, he is far more interested in deals than anything else. And I think that the immediate thing he wanted from this trip were wins. He wanted PR wins, things that he could, that were not going to take a lot of time to develop, although I think that many of the deals he struck will indeed take a lot of time to develop if they actually develop at all. But he wanted announcements. And so he got a number of announcements, and, huge numbers being thrown around in terms of promises to invest in U.S. industries and promises to buy U.S. planes and U.S. weapons. And so, that's what he wanted first and foremost. Second, I think that he wanted to signal that he is more interested in how the region develops in terms of economics and commerce and trade than he is about the security arrangements that we see in the region. In the past, I think that had a president gone to Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the UAE, in light of those relationships and in light of everything going on, you'd probably see some big announcements on defense beyond promises to buy U.S. weapon systems. And we didn't see a lot of that. We didn't see all that much evidence of working on things like common regional defense, or even things that were talked about in Trump's first term, such as a regional ballistic missile shield. These things were largely absent, and he really was trying to telegraph that he thinks the future of the region is geared toward economics and the security aspects, and really the role that the United States plays in terms of being the power that can bring these countries together and that can marshal some sort of regional defense architecture. That seems to be less interesting to him. Lastly, I think it's important to note that in a lot of ways, President Trump likes the Middle East culturally. Uh, he seems to he likes monarchies. That seems pretty clear. He tends to get along better with leaders in non-democratic countries than he does with leaders of democratic countries, and the three countries he visited are not democratic. He likes the pomp and circumstance. He likes the optics. He made a comment at the end of the trip, uh, sort of almost a rueful comment about having to go back home. And I think that he likes being there. And I don't think that we can disconnect that from the fact that he and many of the folks in his inner circle historically have lots of business ties to these countries, have ongoing business ties to these countries. I think fair to say in the case of the president and his family, the Trump and the Trump organization, have future trade and business ties to these countries that they want to foster. And so I think all these things kind of wrap up together, and they all kind of mesh and feed off each other. But as I said, I think that we largely got what we expected from his trip.
So in the lead up to the trip, and even as it was underway toward the beginning, there were some additional deals that were announced that were not purely financial. There was the truce with the Houthis, so this was just bilateral between the US and the Houthis. There was the release of Idan Alexander, which we were grateful to see him reunited with his family after so long. And there was recognition of the newly elected governor, the new government in Syria. And none of these three agreements were coordinated with the Israelis. If you could just comment on the fact that it seems that Trump is making these deals that may impact Israel without coordinating with them, and in some cases, as with the Houthis, without even considering its security.
Right. So President Trump is very clear about his vision for the world. His vision for the world, the MAGA vision, is America first. And I think in a lot of cases, it's Trump first, and sometimes those things mesh, and sometimes they don't. And for all of the ways in which the president is not very transparent in terms of his dealings, he tends to be pretty transparent in his thought processes. And when he talks about wanting to get the U.S. out of the region, and when he talks about wanting to put an end to conflicts in the region, um, he is going to do that irrespective of whether that means that he's coordinating with the Israelis or on the same page as them. And I think we saw this in a whole bunch of ways. President Trump, during the campaign, and certainly since he's returned to the Oval Office, has talked a lot about wanting to see the war in Gaza come to a close, and I'm sure we'll get to this, but I think we're seeing some of that play out now, just this week, and he's talked about wanting to get hostages back, and he had an opportunity to strike a deal over Israel's head for Idan Alexander. I don't think that for anyone who cares about getting living hostages back, I think it's hard to object to that, but it certainly was done over Israel's head, and to the point where now we have the United States for the first time ever directly talking to Hamas, which was done a couple of months ago and was resumed again to get Idan Alexander out, and by many accounts has been happening over the past week as well, as ceasefire discussions have happened. The deal with the Houthis, I think, is an even starker example of this, where the president entered into an agreement that bypassed Israeli concerns entirely. One can make a cogent argument, and certainly I would argue this, that making a deal to get Idan Alexander back is absolutely in Israel's interest, even if the Israeli government might not necessarily agree or was not trying as hard to do it. Getting an Israeli hostage back, particularly when 70% of Israelis want to see deals along those lines, that to me is absolutely in Israel's interest, whether it was coordinated with them or not. It's much harder to make the argument that Israel was taken into consideration at all when it comes to the agreement with the Houthis, where The president was clearly looking for a way out of the U.S. campaign, given how long it's gone on, given how expensive it was really for just the span of a month, given the fact that U.S. drones were shot down and two U.S. F-18 Hornets literally fell off an aircraft carrier in the process of moving the ship around to try to avoid Houthi ballistic missile fire. So he cut a deal with them that basically says, hey, you can keep on firing at anybody as long as it's not us. And the entity that the Houthis are firing at is Israel. So that really didn't take Israel into account at all. And I think it's a very Trumpian way of viewing partners and allies, where certainly the U.S. interest and Israeli interests do not always converge certainly not entirely. In some cases, I would argue they may not converge at all. But on the whole, if we are going to be a good partner and ally, not only to Israel, but to all of the other countries around the world who fit into that category, we should be taking their interests into account, even if they aren't entirely the same as ours. So, this to me was a pretty clear example of the president taking action that not only didn't take Israel into account, but I think erodes Israel's deterrence against the Houthis and possibly against other actors in the region. And when it comes to Syria, this is a place where President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu are pretty clearly not on the same page. And I think it had to be pretty jarring if you are the prime minister to listen to President Trump publicly say, I'm doing this because my good friends, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and President Recep Tayyip Erdogan asked me to do it, when I think it's safe to say that the Israeli government was not asking him to do it. Only days before, we still had Gideon Sa'ar, Israel's foreign minister, talking about Ahmed al-Shara, the leader of Syria, as being a terrorist in a suit. So I don't think that the Israelis were happy with that one, and by all accounts, they did not know that it was coming. I have reason to suspect that folks in the United States government also didn't know that it was coming, but none of these things were done in coordination with Israel, and I don't think even really took Israel into account.
So, following the president's trip to the Gulf, the vice president was supposed to visit Israel. However, just as Defense Secretary Hegseth did a few weeks ago, the vice president actually canceled his trip. What should we glean from Donald Trump skipping Israel on his first trip as president to the region, Vice President Vance's recent cancellation, and even earlier, the cancellation of the defense secretary? And relatedly, in your most recent column, which everyone should read, the Koplow column, you wrote that Israel has to figure out what it can do for Trump. If you could elaborate on what you mean by that.
I think that what's going on here in terms of the president skipping over Israel, and by the way, the same day that there were reports before he went to the Middle East, the same day there were reports that he was being lobbied directly by Ron Dermer and by Ambassador Leiter to go, he publicly came out and said, "I'm not going." I think between that and the vice president also not going, and as you know, the defense secretary canceling a trip that was already announced and on the agenda to go there, I think it's because they view Israel at the moment as a headache. President Trump, he wanted wins, and Israel right now doesn't present any wins for him. He looks at Israel and what does he see? He sees a war that is now beyond the 19-month mark, approaching the 20-month mark of kind of the active phase of the war, and it's one that he wanted the Israelis to wrap up quickly, as he said many times, and now he seems to be losing even more patience. Had he gone to Israel, then he would have absolutely been enmeshed in conversations about Iran policy, And, of everything going on, that is where I think we see the clearest divide between the United States and Israel at the moment, and between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu. So that's probably a conversation that he wanted to avoid too. As you noted, the trip came on the heels of the agreement with the Houthis, which is another unpleasant conversation. And so I don't think that he views Israel as a place that is providing him with good optics right now. And to go there and not have something big to announce and have it be dominated by talk of potential disagreements between the U.S. and Israel, or have it be dominated by a conversation on Gaza that is a topic that he doesn't want to deal with really. It just didn't make sense to him, and so he decided not to go. I think that a lot of people in the American Jewish community made a big mistake with President Trump, and I don't say this in hindsight. I have been saying and writing this consistently since well before the election, and the mistake was that they view him as not only the most pro-Israel president in history by deed, which I would argue with anyway, but many people view him as the most pro-Israel president in history by orientation and temperament, and I think that is flat out wrong. I'm not saying that he's anti-Israel. I don't think he's that either. I think that he seems to have some sort of affinity for Israel, certainly. But ultimately, when his first term, when we were in his first term, Israel presented wins for him, and this time it just does not. And so he's treating Israel differently, not because his orientation toward Israel is any different now than it was 8 years ago. He's treating Israel differently because, in his mind, the circumstances have changed, and he doesn't see a lot of things there as being in his direct interest, and so this is what we're getting. Israel is effectively getting a cold shoulder. And until the Israelis figure out what they are willing to do that fits into the Trump worldview and his basket of what he wants to see, I think the Israelis are going to keep on having these issues where they want to be treated by President Trump as they were treated during his first term, and they're not going to get it until they can give him something.
I wrote something similar yesterday in Haaretz, so I agree with that. There were definitely those that thought that his policy would be different with regard to Israel. With regard to Saudi Arabia, for some time, including throughout the Biden administration, there was an ongoing effort to bring bring Saudi Arabia into the historic Abraham Accords to ensure the normalization of ties between Saudi Arabia and Israel at some point. And it looked like it potentially could be within reach. But in the deal that President Trump cut with the Saudis, it was quite narrow. It had to do with the sales of defense items. Of course, it did not include normalization with Israel. Have we now lost leverage for encouraging the normalization of ties between the United States and Israel at some point in the future?
I think we've absolutely lost leverage. To be clear, I think that we are still going to get Israel-Saudi normalization at some point down the road. But there are two big things that have changed. The first big thing that has changed is the circumstances that are taking place in the region. The Saudi stance on this and Saudi politics have changed dramatically since October 7th. And the type of deal that they would have agreed to on October 6, 2023 just doesn't exist anymore. And so long as the war continues, that's not going to change. And even if the war were to end tomorrow, and I wish that it would, that's not going to put things back the way they were immediately either, or possibly ever. So that's number one. The second thing that has changed is related to what the president did when he was in the Middle East. It's important to understand that while the Saudis always viewed normalization with Israel as bringing benefits to them, mostly economic benefits, but some security benefits as well, the main reason they were willing to talk about it so openly was because they thought that that was the way to unlock a whole bunch of things from the United States. And it was partially the idea that, and this was, remember, when the Saudi relationship with the United States was much worse, in the wake of all sorts of things that MBS did earlier on in his tenure. Part of it was this idea that Israel and the United States are so close, and so the way to get into the United States' good graces is to normalize with Israel. And part of it was just basic math, which is that the Saudis wanted a whole bunch of things. They wanted U.S. blessing and assistance on a civilian nuclear program. They wanted potentially a U.S. defense treaty. They wanted U.S. weapon sales. They saw what President Trump did with the JCPOA, that because it wasn't a treaty, he was able to just rip it up. And they took from that the lesson that anything they get has to be in treaty form. And so they needed to get to 67 votes in the Senate. And they concluded, I think correctly, that they weren't going to get to 67 votes just based on this package of a bilateral deal between the US and Saudi. It was going to have a component of Israel normalization to get some folks on board. And also was probably going to have some component on the Israeli-Palestinian front to get other types of people on board. And by going to Saudi Arabia and striking deals along some of these vectors without the normalization component, even if the war was over, and the hostages were back, and even if Israel was able to somehow defeat Hamas and all this could be put to bed, the things that they wanted from the United States, the president now seems inclined to give them, whether they normalize with Israel or not. And so that big incentive, really the biggest incentive for them to do it, isn't entirely gone now, but a lot of it is gone. And I think that is going to be difficult to restart this process once the other barrier with regard to Gaza and the Palestinians is put to rest. It's going to make it tougher because the Saudis just don't have the same incentives from the United States that they did before.
So there have been very recent reports, we're talking the last 24 hours, that President Trump is frustrated by the ongoing war in Gaza, and he wants it to come to an end. Reportedly, an anonymous White House official said yesterday, President's frustrated about what's happening in Gaza. He wants the war to end. He wants the hostages to come home, and he wants aid to go in, and he wants to start rebuilding Gaza. What do you see President Trump doing to encourage these objectives?
So there are a few things, and I think it remains to be seen. It remains to be seen how hard he's actually going to push to get the war done. So, on the one hand, I think as I noted before, we've seen the president talk about this since before he was president, and again now since he is president, talk about wanting to get the hostages home and talking about wanting to end the war. And I think that that rhetoric, by the way, that we absolutely saw from President Biden as well, does have an impact on the Israelis, and particularly given the fact that Prime Minister Netanyahu is I think he's wary of getting crosswise with President Trump. The constant public rhetoric on in that regard, I think, has an impact. What we're seeing in practice, so we first saw President Trump adopt wholesale President Biden's hostage and ceasefire agreement that was negotiated by the Biden administration and then was pushed by the incoming Trump administration, which is why we saw that ceasefire take hold 2 days before the president took office. He, to his credit, embraced that early on, and the fact that he embraced it, I think, is what got the Israelis over the line to where they had to be. And we've also seen Steve Witkoff since then engage, to the extent that he has the bandwidth, given all of the things that have been put on his plate. We've seen him engage repeatedly and as continuously as possible in these negotiations, largely taking place in Doha between Israel and Hamas, with the Egyptians and the Qataris as mediators, and the U.S. deeply involved, and now by most accounts talking directly to Hamas. So we've seen that, and now in the past few days, aside from the reports in the Washington Post and other places, about the president seeming to lose his patience with the Israeli government, we've seen a whole range of new comments in public from President Trump about wanting to see the war end and wanting to find some sort of humanitarian solution in Gaza. And we've seen Secretary of State Rubio say the same types of things. I thought that it was notable yesterday when he was asked about the restarting of assistance into Gaza that the Israelis are now letting back in. That he said something to the effect of it's a good start, but it's still not enough. And we've also seen the United States form this entity called the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. Whether it actually gets off the ground or not, I think is an open question. I'll say up front, I'm a bit skeptical it's going to work, but try to put his own spin on what a humanitarian assistance mechanism would look like. So, in all of these ways, I think, publicly and just in terms of the actions we're seeing, he does seem to be getting frustrated with the Israeli government, and he does seem to want to try and try to get the war to a close. Now, really, for this to be successful, there has to be more pressure brought to bear on Hamas, and that hopefully is coming from some combination of the diplomatic talks that are taking place, and potentially it's at least the Israelis would argue that as much. Potentially, it's coming from the new Israeli campaign in Gaza. But frankly, there has to be more pressure on the Israelis too, because they need to get more serious about this as well. And I have no qualms at all in saying that Prime Minister Netanyahu does not, and really at no point has seemed to put a priority on getting the hostages back and getting to an agreement. And I don't think that he's actually going to get there without the United States leaning on him harder. So, it remains to be seen, and I think the proof will be in the pudding, how much the White House actually wants to see this war end, and what they're willing to do about it beyond what they've done so far.
Well, certainly, the president was just in Qatar for over a day, and they are the #1 financer of Hamas. Did you see in those interactions any pressure brought to bear by this president on Qatar for its support of Hamas, or any effort to get Qatar to push Hamas to end these hostilities?
No, certainly,
Release
certainly
the
not.
hostages?
Certainly not in the Qataris. I mean, as we all know, the big story that came out of his visit to Qatar is the potential gift of a $400 million airplane to serve, potentially as Air Force One and potentially as the president's private plane after he's out of office. So that certainly does not suggest to me that he was putting a lot of pressure on the Qataris. There has been some talk about things the U.S. may be doing behind the scenes, but if any of that kind of stuff is going on, it was certainly absent from the trip.
Right. For weeks, speaking of Steve Witkoff having a very crowded portfolio, the Trump administration's been negotiating with the Iranians on a nuclear agreement, which was a proposal which was apparently shared with Iran late last week. Most of us have no idea what is in this agreement, but it is clear that Israel is very concerned. What are the prospects of the Trump administration reaching an agreement with Iran that looks quite similar to and may even be more favorable to Iran than the JCPOA, which Trump walked away from 7 years ago? And what would that mean for Israel?
The prospects seem very high to me at the moment. The talks seem to have progressed pretty quickly. Certainly, the statements that we see from the administration are optimistic about getting to an agreement. The president himself confirmed that the United States has passed some sort of framework, at least, onto the Iranians. So, if we take all of this at face value, and I see no reason to do otherwise, then it seems that an agreement at this point is more likely than not. I don't see a world in which particularly given how fast this is moving, I don't see a world in which any agreement is substantially different than the JCPOA, and certainly not in terms of it being a tougher agreement for the Iranians. There would be no way to negotiate this so quickly and have all these positive signs if the administration were holding Iran's feet to the fire in a tougher way. And on the technical aspects, the team that the administration has appointed to oversee the technical parts of this, at least from the names that we've seen, they are not actually technical experts, which says to me that they would really have no choice but to rely on what was in the JCPOA. And for all sorts of reasons, if you without getting into a debate over whether the JCPOA was a good agreement or a bad agreement, if you just take what was in there and you put it on there now, because President Trump pulled out of it, the Iranians are just much farther ahead. So it wouldn't even make sense to talk about the types of restrictions in the JCPOA today, because the Iranians have enriched since the president pulled out of the JCPOA to just a much higher degree, and they've made tons of progress on centrifuge research and operation. They have so much more know-how today than they did in 2015 when the JCPOA was signed, and than they did when President Trump pulled out of it in, I think it was 2018, right? So you couldn't, if you just even took that agreement word for word and you put it in place, I think by definition it would be a worse deal and a better deal for the Iranians than what came before and what the president pulled out of. So, where does that leave the Israelis? The Israelis are freaking out about this. I think, and it's on a number of vectors. They're skeptical. Many of them are skeptical that there's any deal to be had with the Iranians. They're skeptical that a deal, if one is struck only on the nuclear issue and it doesn't address ballistic missiles or proxies, is going to be a bad deal as far as they're concerned. They're certainly skeptical over the emerging details from the agreement, and you see this all the time where the Trump administration, the president and Marco Rubio and other officials, they kind of go back and forth over this question of does Iran have to dismantle its military nuclear program, or does it have to dismantle its nuclear program entirely? Can it have any enrichment capacity, or does it all have to be shipped out of the country? The Israelis are very clear that from their perspective, there is no such thing as a favorable deal that allows Iran to enrich at all, or that allows them with any civilian nuclear program. And while we've had conflicting statements from the president on down, it seems pretty clear to me, just given the preponderance of the statements, that what they're negotiating is not the Israeli demand to have complete dismantlement of any nuclear program, no matter what the restrictions are, no matter what it's intended for. So this is a huge divide right now between the United States and Israel, and there's the report in CNN yesterday, or maybe it was today, about potential Israeli preparations for a strike on Iranian nuclear sites, even as these negotiations are going on. I don't know how much credence to put into the truth of that report, or I should say maybe whether it's actually verifiable and going on. But at the least, it's certainly the Israelis doing everything they can to signal their displeasure with what's going on. Whether they're actually making these preparations or not, they definitely want people to think that they are. And that maybe more than anything else is a sign of the real split that we see right now between Trump and Netanyahu on this.
Okay, so Michael, you've just described what seems to be a very fast-moving train here in terms of a potential Iranian nuclear agreement that is likely going to be even more favorable to Iran than the JCPOA, just given numerous factors and the fact that they have been enriching since Trump walked away from the agreement. Now, we're old enough to remember 10 years ago when Obama was nearing such an agreement, Netanyahu came to address a joint session of Congress There were numerous very public efforts to stop the JCPOA, to persuade Democrats not to support it. What do you make of the fact that this tension you're describing and the Israeli concerns are happening largely behind the scenes? The same could be said with regard to what I assume was concern that Trump cut a deal with the Houthis without including the Israelis or even considering the Israelis. And we've seen the Houthi missiles targeting Israel even increase since that deal was cut. I mean, what do you make of the fact that we aren't hearing publicly from the Israeli government about their concerns with regard to the administration's very fast-moving policy to cut deals that frankly aren't necessarily aligned with their interests?
So first of all, I think we all know that Prime Minister Netanyahu approaches Republicans different than the way he approaches Democrats. He has a very long track record in this regard, and I don't think it's even a debatable point. Were this a Democratic president, I'm sure we would see far more public Israeli outrage and statements from the prime minister and other government officials, and potentially another invite from congressional Republicans to the prime minister to give a joint address bashing U.S. policy. We just don't see that from Prime Minister Netanyahu when they're Republican presidents, irrespective of what it is they're doing and how much he disagrees. Second, I think that there is a unique aspect here about the way the prime minister approaches President Trump, which is that President Trump is unpredictable. I think that even if it caught many people by surprise, Prime Minister Netanyahu probably always suspected the transactional nature and that Israel was not actually all that special in President Trump's eyes. And so, he watches what happens when Zelensky came to the United States and got got ambushed and yelled at in the Oval Office. He absolutely wants to avoid something like that. He does not want President Trump out there on Truth Social, posting about him and blasting him and causing him all sorts of political problems. And so he's treading very carefully because I think he is worried about what happens if he says the wrong thing and President Trump turns on him. Because when you are dealing with somebody who is so openly and nakedly transactional, that's what you have to worry about. And larger national interests or even personal relationships are going to take a back seat. So, we see him really tiptoeing around all of these various issues. If you read the Israeli press, you see every few days anonymous officials kind of obliquely criticizing some of the things that President Trump is doing. Many of us can probably guess who those anonymous officials are. And you can see them spinning their wheels trying to register their displeasure in a way that isn't going to bring the Trump temper down on their heads. So I will be surprised if we ever get to a point where there is a direct confrontation initiated by Prime Minister Netanyahu in the way that he has done with President Biden or with President Obama. But there's no question to me that he's probably in some state of distress over the state of his relationship right now with President Trump.
It's interesting that you mentioned the relationship between Netanyahu and Democrats, which is fundamentally different than with Republicans. But even at this stage, and I should mention, I am incorporating what I see in the chat in terms of audience questions into my questions now. What do you make of where the Republicans are? I mean, do you see rising concerns among Republicans with regard to the administration's policies and as it impacts Israel, including Iran?
I think we see it in some places and less so in others. There have been Republican members of Congress yesterday and again even today when Secretary Rubio was in front of SFRC and today he's in front of HVAC, who when discussing Iran and the direction that things seem to be going, raise concerns about the Israel angle, or raise concerns about enrichment, or raise concerns about just the nature of negotiating a deal with this Iranian regime. So you see it pop up for sure, and it's not just a few voices, but in general, the Republicans have been willing to give President Trump an enormous amount of leeway on all sorts of things, including things that they themselves have opposed for a very long time. I think we see it probably the most prominently when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine issue, where people who, for decades were among the most hawkish of Russia hawks, have followed the president's lead. And now perhaps as he's starting to doubt that President Putin is actually his friend or a good guy, now we start to maybe see Republican rhetoric shift in conjunction with the president, but they tend to follow what the president is doing. On the Houthi issue, there was some discontent, but a lot less of it. I haven't seen a whole lot in the last few days of Republican discontent over potential breaks with Israel over the Gaza war. So we see it a little bit over Iran, but not as much in other places, and I think that's pretty characteristic of how most elected Republicans have approached President Trump on every issue.
Okay, last tough question, and then I'll ask our final question, which I promise won't be as tough. But of course, one of the most pressing issues for all of us is the release of the hostages. We were relieved to see Idan Alexander released and in relatively good health, but there are still, I believe, 49 more, maybe fewer alive, but they all must be released. What do you think we can do at this point? People are continually asking, what can we be doing? What should we be doing? Should we write to our members of Congress? Is there anything that we can do to continue to increase the pressure to release the hostages? It's been far too long.
I think we have to demand that that the Israeli government do everything it can possibly do and make every single possible good faith effort. And I don't think that we actually have seen a good faith effort from the Israeli government to get to a comprehensive deal that will see all the hostages released and that will, by definition, end up with a ceasefire in Gaza. The numbers on getting hostages back are stark, and they are as clear as could possibly be. 148 living hostages since October 7th have returned home through negotiations. 5 of them were not negotiations. 5 of them were quote unquote goodwill gestures. The 4 women who were returned very early on, and now Idan Alexander. So 5, but 143 have been through negotiations. 8 living hostages have been returned through successful IDF operations to secure their release militarily. The numbers could not be more clear than that. The hostages are not coming back through IDF military operations. They aren't. And there is no incentive at all for Hamas, particularly when we all talk about Hamas rightly as a nihilistic group that is willing to sacrifice down to the last Palestinian. Why anybody would think that they will just magically release 58 hostages in return for anything other than the end of the war, I don't understand. But both these things can't be true. It can't be that Hamas is an irrational death cult that is willing to fight to the last Palestinian, and also that if we have another few weeks of IDF operations, then they'll just drop their demands for an end to the war and release the hostages without getting what they want. Those two things cannot be true at the same time. So, and I am as sure as I can be that it's the first one that's true, that they are not going to give up, no matter how much military pressure is put on them. So if we want hostages back, that means a deal, and there is not going to be a deal without the United States weighing in on it as heavily as possible, and that means for the Jewish community to speak out individually and within our institutions. It means making sure that that every member of Congress with whom we have influence, and I would, hope every single Jewish member of Congress at a minimum, would loudly and proudly talk about this every single day and really press that there has to be a hostage deal and ceasefire. Otherwise, very tragically, the 58 hostages remaining and 20, 21, 22, of whom are hopefully still alive, they're not going to get out without it happening in this fashion. And so I think that's what we should all be doing. And there's really nothing short of that is going to work.
Okay, well, our final questions, and actually maybe this isn't an easy answer, given the tone of our conversation, but wondering what gives you hope? And then, just as evidence that I'm reading everything in the chat, someone is wondering the subject of the artwork behind you. Perhaps that's what gives you hope. So we can end there.
Sure. Well, I'll start with the second one. The artwork behind me is a lithograph of Ted Williams in his last at bat at Fenway Park in September 1960. For those of you who don't know, in his last at bat, he hit a home run and then famously rounded the bases and resisted the calls from the fans to come out for a curtain call, leading to a very famous John Updike essay where he has the famous line, "Gods don't answer letters." Anyways, I'm a diehard Red Sox fan, and that's what that is behind me. And this year, the Red Sox are not giving me a huge amount of hope, at least not so far. In terms of what gives me hope, listen, I just talked about the fact that 156 hostages have come home alive. I would not have predicted that 19 months ago. I wouldn't have, and I would have predicted it even less a year ago, and yet here we are, and a huge number of Israeli hostages have indeed come back alive, back to their families, and I think that in itself should give us hope that that there are potential better outcomes out there. And what also gives me hope is that there are so many issues that divide American Jews and Israeli Jews, but this is not one of them. 70% of Israelis want to see a hostage and ceasefire agreement now. They prioritize the hostages back. They understand the terrible cost that will mean for Israel and for Israel's security and what it means to effectively leave Hamas in place. And they're still choosing what to me is the more optimistic and hopeful approach, and prioritizing the fact that Israel cannot leave its people behind. And that is an issue where, unlike so many others where American Jews want one thing and Israeli Jews want another, we want the same things here because 70% of Israeli Jews want this, and I'd wager a guess that more than 70% of American Jews want it, and it gives me hope for hopefully what's accomplishable. It gives me hope for the future of Jewish peoplehood, and it gives me hope that hopefully in the not too distant future we can have a better politics and what I would define as better governments, both in Israel and the United States, that can get back and build on this joint cooperation, get back to working towards a better situation for Israelis and for Palestinians.
Well, thank you, Michael. Your insight and wisdom is always deeply appreciated and gives us some hope. And we really appreciate your partnership. And for those who don't already subscribe, you should check out Michael's weekly column. I assume coming out today. Is that right? The Koplow
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow. Okay, right. It's Wednesday. Coming out tomorrow, every Thursday. It's really it's a must read every week. So thank you so much. Thanks for your partnership. Appreciate it. And I'm going to turn things over to our Chief Program Officer, Bobby Saferstein, to wrap today's event.
Thanks, Halie, and thanks to Michael Koplow and each of you for joining us for today's program, unpacking Trump's trip to the Middle East and what it means for Israel. At this critical moment when Trump and congressional Republicans seem all but certain to strip away even more rights and protections of millions of Americans, it may feel like we're powerless to do anything, but we're not. And we must not fall into the trap of believing that the challenges before us are insurmountable. Our strength comes from each other, and together as a community, we are making a difference. Here are 5 ways you can take action with JDCA right now. 1, as millions of Americans are at risk of losing their health care, we encourage you to join JDCA, urging members of Congress to oppose cuts to Medicaid by clicking on the link in the chat. 2, please make sure to read and help us to amplify Halie's latest op-ed in Haaretz, calling out Donald Trump and how he's not an ally of Israel nor a true partner of Jewish Americans. To share this message with those who need to hear it, and we all know someone, please click on the link in the chat. Number 3, join JDCA's virtual week of action from June 9th to the 11th. In just 2.5 weeks, JDCA's network of volunteers and supporters will meet with their congressional delegations to advocate for and discuss our policy priorities as Jewish Democrats. It's an incredibly meaningful experience that you don't want to miss, so please sign up at the link in the chat. Number 4, sign up and join us tomorrow night, Thursday, May 22nd at 6 p.m. Eastern, when JDCA officially launches our Youth Leaders Network with Ohio Representative Amelia Sykes. If you happen to be 18 to 29 years old or know someone who is and wants to join a community of passionate advocates working to elect Democrats who share both our Jewish and Democratic values, please click on or share at the link in the chat. Finally, if you're not yet a JDCA member, please consider becoming one or increasing your membership level to support our work. JDCA members access special benefits such as members-only programs with leading experts and exclusive Q&A opportunities during events like these. Our next members event will take place on June 25th at 12 p.m. Eastern with Washington Institute Director of Research and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East, Dana Stroll. You don't want to miss it, so please click on the link and become a member today. As we close out today's program, we remain grateful that Idan Alexander is home. We continue to demand the release of the remaining hostages being held in Gaza and look to the day when there is an end to this war that has gone on for far too long and claimed far too many. Thank you again for joining JDCA. We'll see you again soon.